1881, in the midst of the Revolutionary War, the 13 states had agreed to establish a new central government under the Articles of the Confederation and Perpetual Union. The Articles created a confederation of states. Each state retained its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. The weak central government consisted of Congress, a single house, in which each state had one vote. No other branch of government existed, no executive or judiciary, and the Congress had no power to regulate trade or levy and collect taxes. Now here's a short summary of each of those 13 Articles of the Confederation. Article 1 created the name of the combined 13 states as the United States of America. Article 2, state governments still had their own powers and were not listed in the Articles of the Confederation. The combined states were responsible for, this is Article 3, the combined states were responsible for helping to protect each other from attacks. Article 4, people can travel freely from state to state. However, criminals who left the state where they committed the crime would be sent back for trial. Article 5 creates the Congress of the Confederation. Each state gets one vote in that Congress and can send between 2 to 7 people to participate in Congress. Article 6, the new central government is responsible for working with other countries, including trade agreements and declaring war. States were required to have trained soldiers who could be ready to fight. Article 7, states could choose their own military leaders. Article 8, each state government had to raise money to give to the new central government. Article 9, only the new central government had the power to make and declare war and make peace with foreign countries. The central government was also responsible for assigning ambassadors to represent the United States in other countries. Article 10 created a group called the Committee of States who could act for the Congress of Confederation when the Congress was not working. Article 11 stated that Canada could join the new nation if wanted. Oh, we dodged the bullet there, huh? All right, Article 12 stated that the new nation agreed to pay for earlier war debts. Article 13 declared that the Articles of the Confederation were forever and could only be changed by the Congress of Confederation and if all the states agreed. All right, so by 1787, war debts were piling up as many states had fallen behind in paying what they owed. States were imposing tariffs on each other and they're fighting over borders. In Britain was pissed because pre-war debts were not being paid and it was refusing to honor the Paris Treaty, which had, that was the treaty that really ended the war. So recognizing that things were not going well, Congress decided on February 21st, 1787, quote, that there are defects in the present Confederation, unquote. And they resolved that a convention should be held in Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of the Confederation and to render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies, this is a quote, I'm sorry, they used weird words back then, y'all know that. Okay, exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. I could not talk like they did, so thank you for bearing with me. They were all really brilliant, really high IQs. Now, I'm not saying I'm not brilliant with a high IQ, or none of you are, but y'all know what I mean. All right. Now, before the convention officially began, Madison and the other delegates from Virginia drafted a plan, the Virginia Plan, for correcting the Articles of the Confederation. And their plan went well beyond the amendments and corrections and actually laid out a completely new instrument of government. The plan provided for 3 separate branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative branch would have 2 houses, and the first house to be elected by the people in each state, and the second by the first house from the list created by the state. Much of today's Constitution is inspired by the Virginia Plan. Now, on May 25th, the first Constitutional Convention went into session at the Philadelphia State House. George Washington was elected the presiding officer. Those involved had agreed to a rule of secrecy. So without the careful notes of James Madison, who attended every session and carefully transcribed the proceedings, today we really wouldn't have a clue what happened, as I had said earlier. Now, here are the major debates that unfolded in the first Constitutional Convention. Number one was the representation in Congress. The general outline of the Virginia plan was well received, but the question arose over how to elect members of the two houses. For half the summer, the convention debated on this issue. Some delegates strongly opposed having the people elect the lower house. Roger Sherman of Connecticut distrusted the notion of democracy. People, he said, should, quote, should have little to do as may be about government, because they are constantly liable and misled. Damn right, Roger Sherman. All right. Others spoke strongly in favor of popular vote, including George Mason of Virginia. Mason had faith in the common man and believed that the members of the lower house, quote, ought to know and sympathize with every part of the community. Good thing nobody listened to George Mason of Virginia. When it came to the most difficult issue, however, that was the question of how the states were to be represented in Congress. Things got heated. Representatives from small states believed that representation based on representation based on population would destroy their states' rights. David Brearley of New Jersey said that representation based on population was unfair and unjust. The large states, he said, quote, will carry everything before them, and the small states like Georgia will be obliged to throw themselves constantly into the scale of some large one in order to have any weight at all, end quote. Other delegates like James Wilson of Pennsylvania, one of 3 big states, argued that only representation based on population would be fair. For New Jersey, a state with about a third of the population of Pennsylvania, to have the same number of votes as Pennsylvania. Quote, I say no, it is unjust, end quote. According to Madison's notes, on June 30th, the delegates from Connecticut proposed a compromise suggesting that, quote, the proportion of suffrage in the first branch should be according to the number of free inhabitants, and that in the second branch, or Senate, each state should have 1 vote and no more. And also, each state should, end quote, sorry. And also, each state would have 2 members of Senate chosen by the state legislature. The proposal did not stop the bitter opposition and fierce debate. Some delegates began to leave the protest, and a sense of gloom settled over the state house. It seems, Sherman wrote, quote, that we have got to a point that we cannot move one way or the other, end quote. Washington wrote Alexander Hamilton, who was away, that the crisis was so bad he almost despaired of seeing a favorable outcome. So at this point, people are giving up that they're ever going to come to an agreement. The intense debates lasted for 2 more weeks, but finally, the delegates came together on July 16th and agreed to the Connecticut Compromise. The small states were jubilant. I don't know why I wrote that word, sorry. They were happy. And the large states uncomfortable. But from then on, things moved more smoothly. Now, the second argument was giving power to the president. After arriving at a compromise on electing a legislature, the convention addressed the other parts of the Virginia plan. The plan called for a national executive, but did not say how long the executive should serve. The executive would have a general authority to execute the national laws. The plan also resolved that the executive, working with a committee of judges, would have power to review and veto laws passed by Congress unless the act, quote, unless the act of the national legislature was be again passed, end quote. The delegates generally agreed on the need for a separate executive independent of the legislature. The executive would also be called president, that was noted there. And they also agreed on giving the president the power to veto laws, but only if his veto was subject to an override, per Madison's notes. Quote, Mr. Sherman was against enabling any one man to stop the will of the whole. No man could be found so far above the rest in wisdom. They came to a quick decision that the executive should have the power to veto legislation to a 2/3 override in both houses of the legislature. But they could not easily agree on how the executive should be elected, end quote. Delegates proposed many different methods for electing president. One alternative was a direct election by the people, but this obviously drew controversy. Another alternative was to have the president chosen either by the national or state legislature, or some believe that the executive should be chosen by a national legislature. That would be more creature to the legislature without independent judgment. Delegates voted more than 60 times before the method was chosen. The final agreement was to have the president elected by electors in each state who would be chosen, quote, in such manner, end quote, as its legislature might direct. Each elector would vote for two people, one of whom could not be an inhabitant of the same state. The person with the most votes would become president, and if no person had a majority of the votes, the House of Representatives would choose a candidate from the top 5, with each state's delegation casting one vote. Two more questions about the president also provoked intense debate. One, how long should the president's term be? The convention also decided on a 4-year term with no limit on how many times the president could be reelected. The number 3 debate was stopping the slave trade. And this one's like such a big deal right now. This is what people talk about, and a lot of people don't know what I'm about to tell you about it. There's deep disagreement that arose over slavery. The economy of the states depended almost entirely on agricultural products produced by slaves. To protect their economy, the southern states insisted on 2 proposals. One was to ban Congress from taxing exports to protect their agricultural exports. And the second proposal was to forbid Congress from banning the importation of slaves. In fact, the word slave was never even used in the Constitution. The proposal was written to prohibit Congress from interfering in the importation, quote, of such persons as the, end quote, as the states shall think proper to admit. When the convention received a draft containing these proposals, another heated debate erupted on the regulation of free trade and on the issues of morality. Luther Martin of Maryland said that forbidding Congress from banning the importation of slaves was, quote, inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution and dishonorable to America. Governor Morris of Pennsylvania said that slavery was a, quote, nefarious institution, and that a, quote, curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed, end quote. George Mason of Virginia spoke at length about the horrors of slavery and criticized slave owners who he called, quote, petty tyrants, and the slave traders who he said, quote, from a lust of gain embarked on this nefarious traffic, end quote. Ultimately, the delegates who strongly opposed slavery realized that pressing against it would make it impossible for the states to come together. They worked out a compromise with the southern states. They agreed that Congress should not tax exports and placed a 20-year moratorium on the slave trade. Sidebar, on the first day President Jefferson was able to, he outright banned the slave trade. No more slaves in and out of America. And in the final reluctant concession of the South, the delegates approved a fugitive slave clause, which would later be abolished by the 13th Amendment. 4, why no Bill of Rights? The delegates had been meeting for almost 4 months when the Committee of Style presented the final draft of the Constitution on September 12th. The draft contained a new provision requiring trial by jury in criminal cases tried in the new federal court system. Trial by jury was considered one of the many basic rights, and that's when George Mason stood up and proposed including a full Bill of Rights listing the basic individual rights that a government could not violate. He believed a Bill of Rights would, quote, give great quiet to the people, end quote, and could be written up in just a few hours. Eldridge Gary agreed and moved for a committee to prepare a Bill of Rights. Mason seconded this motion, but it was defeated by a vote of 10-0. Madison's notes don't explain why this motion was defeated. But we do already know that 8 of the states already had state constitutions, and Madison quotes only the words of Roger Sherman here. He says, "The state declarations of rights are not repealed by the Constitution and, being in force, are sufficient." 3 months after the Constitution was signed, Thomas Jefferson wrote to Madison saying that it had been a big mistake to omit a Bill of Rights. Quote, "A Bill of Rights," he said, "is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth," end quote. And many others agreed. When the Constitution was being ratified by the states, many people opposed the Constitution just because it did not contain a Bill of Rights. In Massachusetts and in 6 other states, the ratifying conventions recommended adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. And soon after the first Congress convened in 1789, it responded to the request of these 7 states and approved 10 constitutional amendments drafted by James Madison that became the Bill of Rights. On Monday, September 17th, when the delegates met to sign the Constitution, Benjamin Franklin had prepared a speech. "The Constitution may not be perfect," he said, "but, quote, I cannot help expressing a wish that every member of the convention who may still have objections to it, to make manifest our unanimity, put his name to the instrument," end quote. And all of the 44 delegates who were present did sign except for 3. The work was finished at 4 o'clock when, according to George Washington's diary, the quote, "members adjourned to the city tavern, dined together, and took a cordial leave of each other." When the document was presented to Congress and to the country, it surprised everyone. In fact, it provoked controversy in many states. But by July 1788, 9 states had ratified it, and it went into effect. Elections were held, and on March 4th, 1789, the first Congress and President, George Washington, took office under the new U.S. Constitution. The Constitution was a bundle of compromises, and that was designed to meet certain specific wants of states and to remedy the defects experienced under the Articles of the Confederation. But the Constitution succeeded beyond even the hopes of its strongest advocates. As Benjamin Rush wrote after the celebration in Philadelphia, "'Tis done, we have become a nation." Thanks. Does anybody have any questions that I can try to answer? Yes.
You left out Benjamin Rush's comment when he said, "We must put medical freedom into the Constitution."
Neat.
Unfortunately, that never happened. He said that. He was a doctor.
Okay, yeah, I've never read that. I'm interested. I'll look into that for sure. Anybody else?
You ever done much reading into, well, especially with the popularity of the Hamilton play and everything, I had to try to Google outside education. My daughter loved the play so much, but was saying, well, if Hamilton had his way, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think he was recommending that Washington basically get king, that he'd be president for life, and he get to appoint the senators for every state.
Yes, Hamilton was like a devil's advocate for George Washington. He wanted him to be a king. He wanted him to have more power than he did. It was actually Hamilton's idea during the Whiskey Rebellion that George Washington go down with the militia. George Washington didn't want to do that. So Hamilton he's kind of the bad guy in history when it comes to a lot of different stories about him. He wasn't the best guy. He's usually portrayed as a pretty bad one, but yeah. Anybody else? Any questions for me?
How do you like Florida?
Hi, I like Florida pretty well. It's much better than Massachusetts. I left Massachusetts, went to Florida last year. Any other questions? Thank God. Oh, hi, yeah. What's up?
Do you have any comments on your Twitter experience?
Any comments on my Twitter experience? Let me see. A year ago, almost to the day, I was unbanned from Twitter. It was the day after Elon Musk said he was buying Twitter, and I randomly got my 1.5-year permanent suspended account back, which was totally random, I'm sure. And ever since then, I've just been growing really rapidly and expanding my voice and meeting lots of amazing people and making new friends. And it's been a really great experience having a Twitter account, I guess. Yeah. Elon Musk followed me. That's cool, right? Yeah. So lots of fun things like that happen. You can really expand your voice and stuff. Any other questions? All right, thank you all so much.
Josie, thank you.
Thank you.
I think we're gonna leave the chair up here so that Clint can do like a Clint Eastwood bit, right? Do you guys remember that with, that's okay, we'll take it away if you don't want. So you might have noticed, kind of to piggyback on Twitter, you might have noticed that the caucus social media has been on fire lately, has really blown up. That's something we've been incredibly proud of. And when that started to happen, when people like Jeff Charles started to come into our lives, people with influence, people who were working in other mediums, we had to have a discussion around who should we link those influencers with? Who can we point them to? Who is smart and articulate and rabidly would support the Mises Caucus platform? And when we had that discussion, this name came up, and that's Clint Russell. Clint is a tireless advocate, and he has well-known, well-loved, and in return for that affection, what he gives us is kind of a rabid defense of liberty all of the time. We are so grateful that he is here. You know him, he is the host of Liberty Lockdown. We're grateful to have him in Austin. Clint, come on up.
Thank you. Good afternoon. How you guys doing? I was born in 1982. That means I'm a man at 40. Anybody else in here a man yet? You don't become a man until you're 40, according to that press conference. So pretty cool. I feel old. I'm like 5 months older than Dave, which is weird because I look up to him, but that's okay. I'm an inch taller. So I was born to Dan and Dina. Beautiful people. Entrepreneurial spirits, kind of imbued in me a questioning of authority from a very young age. God bless them. I think that's probably the most important thing you can teach your children. And I got that in spades, probably too much. My school teachers didn't much love me. At the time, we were at the tail end of the Cold War. And also at the time, I was too young to realize this, but no one thought that it would ever end. And if it were to end, it would probably be in a nuclear holocaust. So pretty intense times. Feels like we're kind of back in those days. By 1991, less than a decade later, the USSR had fallen. And then in response, we started the Iraq War. How that makes sense, I don't know. The narrative at the time was that Saddam is crazy and babies were being thrown out of incubators onto the ground. So we had to do the right thing. Had to continue with our imperialist bent. 1992, there was a Ruby Ridge massacre. At the time, I was told that it was crazy white nationalists that had basically killed themselves. It was a little bit different than the reality. 1993, you have the Waco siege. Once again, terroristic cult-like members just angry at the government. Then you have the 1993 WTC bombing. Dangerous terrorists, but this time of Muslim description. 1994, you have the OKC bombing, which is once again just a domestic terror incident. Nothing more to that story whatsoever. By 1999, you have the Columbine shooting because Marilyn Manson's music was scary. That's what I was told. I was in high school at the time. In 2001, you have the dot-com bust and 9/11 because of greed and too much freedom. That's why. Sometimes people fly planes into buildings because you're too free. Don't be too free, it's dangerous. 2008, the Great Recession. Pure greed, nothing more to that story. Incredible. It's incredible how simple history is when you only go off of corporate narratives. 2020, COVID. Crazy promiscuous pangolin shut down the world. That's what happened. Don't you question it. And then today, we must risk World War III because Putin is Hitler and democracy must be defended even if we all have to die to make that so. These are the actual narratives that I've been told throughout my life. So does it matter? Does it matter what we do, what you guys do, what we all do every single day when we counter these narratives in real time? They say libertarians have no power. We have no power, folks. We don't have the levers of the political apparatus by which we can suppress and crush our enemies. So does any of this matter? Well, in 1982, we were 1 trillion in debt. By 1991, when the USSR had fallen, we were 4 trillion in debt. Despite the fact that NATO explicit purpose was to defend the world against the overarching power of the USSR, they didn't dissolve. They continued to expand. This matters later. Believe me, it matters. We'll get to that. 92, Ruby Ridge happened to be that an unarmed woman holding her baby was shot by a sniper, murdered in cold blood. 1993, Waco, 82 men, women, and children, many of which were incinerated for no reason, despite the fact that the DAA and the FBI had been watching their property and could have taken out Koresh at any time prior to prevent that catastrophe. 1994, the OKC bombing, despite having a litany of FBI connections, including FBI and DEA agents, as well as every alphabet agency under the sun that was involved in that event. Also, even if you were to buy the excuse of the alleged culprits, they did it as response to Waco, blowback, if you will, for domestic terrorism from our own government. That story isn't told. It's not told unless the people in this room are willing to say it. There are very few people outside of this room that are willing to discuss any of what I'm describing right now. That matters. Does it matter that 9/11 was in fact a response, according to bin Laden himself, to the starving of hundreds of thousands of children in Iraq because of our sanction regime there? Does that matter? Does it matter that we armed and funded the Mujahideen in opposition to the USSR in Afghanistan in the 1980s, creating the foundation by which his entire regime was established? Does any of that matter? Does that history matter? I'd say it matters deeply. Does it matter that the Great Recession of 2008 was almost entirely a product of Federal Reserve policy? Does it matter that we're the only people on earth that seem to understand Federal Reserve policy? I'd say it matters a lot. I'd say that if we were to shut up about that, then these absurd narratives that greed and capitalism are in fact what we're up against. We're the culprit, and every time we have any sort of economic upheaval, that narrative would stick. Can you imagine a world without the intransigent lunatics in this room? It would be ugly. It would be boring. You're right. Oh, Scott Horton's here, my mentor. What's up, brother? Does it matter that Anthony Fauci, through NIH and NIAID, was surreptitiously funding gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology via EcoHealth Alliance and Peter Daszak? Does it matter that Peter Daszak was then put on the WHO team to go and investigate the origins of COVID, despite the fact that the motherfucker knew exactly where it came from. I'd say that matters. Does it matter that Anthony Fauci was put in charge of the lockdown protocols, despite the fact that he was simultaneously lying about the origin for which he had intimate knowledge? I'd say that matters. People say we don't have power. People say these counter narratives don't matter. That should fucking piss you off. It should piss you off that the truth doesn't matter according to them. That the people in this room who live by the truth, who seek truth every single day, that we don't matter because we don't want to crush our enemies. What a bunch of nonsense. What utter nonsense. Sorry, get upset. Does it matter that there was a State Department sponsored coup in Ukraine via the Maidan Revolution in 2014? Does it matter that the Ukrainian government proceeded to bomb the Donbas region of Ukraine in what most would describe as a civil war for 8 years? Does it matter that Julian Assange leaked the Niet means Niet cable, for which he now languishes in prison for no reason, for doing his job of journalism, where quite explicitly they informed our government that if you expand to our border, particularly Ukraine, it is the reddest of red lines. Does that matter? When he now invades Ukraine unprovoked for no reason. We could have never seen this coming. Oh my God, he's Hitler. Does any of that matter? Does that history matter? Very much it does. Does it matter that Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt are caught on tape discussing the establishment of the Ukrainian government post-revolution, post-coup? I'd say it matters. And my internet just kicked off, so I can't keep my notes going. That's a bummer. I think you guys get the point. It matters. If not for our willingness to seek truth in a time that is so filled with deception, it's really remarkable. And I don't know, if I'm being honest with you, I don't know if all of the history that we've been told has been as rife with lies. I don't know. But I do know that the current events are the ones that we can make an impact on, the ones that we can actually course correct the narrative, that we can help civilization and our culture progress as opposed to regressing into civil conflict and World War III. Continue to keep the faith, please. You guys are very important. There are very few people on this planet that understands the things that you do. Realize your purpose, and please continue pressing forward with me. Thank you. Q&A? No.
You're welcome to. Absolutely.
Sure. Any questions for me, if you guys got any? Josie, what's up? The traffic in Miami sucks, man. It's really bad. So I'm definitely not going to stay in Miami long term, but hopefully I'll have a job and a reason to move to Virginia here soon. So stay tuned on that. So.
To see what your comments were on was how the more things change, the more they stay the same, the more time passes, rather, because I was just reading on Twitter how Victoria Nuland apparently was visiting Sudan, and the parties were getting along and negotiating with each other.
Yeah.
And then she's apparently just left that out.
Yeah, he's asking about Victoria Nuland destroying yet another nation in Sudan. Look, the reality is there were biolabs in Sudan, Ukraine, as well as China. And those seem to be the three hotbeds for potential wars. I mean, obviously there is a war in one of them. So, look, I described her last week as the Grim Reaper of the State Department. Victoria Nuland is a very nefarious character, and as best I can tell, she just travels the globe stirring shit up. So yeah, history does repeat, but I think the fact that her name has gone from complete anonymity to one of kind of being, reviled is progress. That there's a problem with like expecting, given that we're being censored too. We have the entire state apparatus, including big tech, which is, in my opinion, state apparatus at this point, that is trying to suppress these realities, and yet we still break through. We still find a way. So, yeah, it rhymes, it repeats, but it doesn't matter. We can't give up. What's the option?
Pretty soon, the Libertarian Party is going to choose a nominee for president. Do you have any insight on how the Libertarian presidential campaign should go? Of course, we've heard Dave's comments on these things, but I wonder if you have any particular insight of how you would run the campaign for president.
I mean, the reason I'm involved in any of this is because of Dave Smith. I think that his vision, the vision that all of his supporters had for that run, I share it. I think that having a prominent, compelling, passionate, intelligent, funny speaker that can actually reach people on, by the millions via internet and decentralized platforms, ones that, are kind of outside of mainstream control, it's the only option. I think that the value in it is that I would like to see a Ron Paul movement that exists within the LP banner. I think it'd be really special if we could do that. As for beyond that, whoever it ends up being, I hope that their focus is not so much on tallying votes. And I know that'll upset some people, but I'm more like, even if you have to push some people away, I would rather you tell it exactly how it is. I want that messenger to be someone who can wake up enough people to get enough pressure to prevent World War III. Those are the things that matter to me most. So, and then maybe 4 years after that, then you have a real revolution. I don't know. Oh, there's a lot of hands. So, hat. Your hat.
In regards to what you said, Anthony Fauci, do you think that Trump was also to know what was going on? He was just putting on an act to keep his supporters?
I don't think so. I think that he was largely oblivious to the operations of his government, which sounds kind of funny, but that's my honest opinion. I think he's the type of dude who's just like, I'm the spokesperson. You guys do the fucking work, So I don't think he was really privy, and I think that the people that really run the government did a great job of kind of circumventing him. I also don't think he's not one of us, so he's got a lot of pitfalls that even if he was in charge, things wouldn't have gone great. But I think that things went really, really poorly because he was delegating to a bunch of scumbags that he entrusted for no apparent reason.
So I watched your debate with Destiny on the Border Grant was really well done.
Thank you.
Your part. And I was surprised how he was just denying facts about saying that there wasn't a coup or something. You're talking about the phone call with Victoria Nuland. Were you surprised with that? Did you have a conversation about it?
No, I wasn't surprised because I did my homework and I watched as many of his debates as I could get my hands on to know his angle. Look, the truth is, if your litmus test for fact is it reported in Ukrainian news? Well then, yeah, I'm not going to be able to prove you wrong. But I kind of gave up, knowing that, I kind of gave up on trying to convince him, and I was more there for the audience than I was for him. I did get him to acknowledge that he would like to see nuclear disarmament as soon as possible. So I felt like that was a compromise that I could settle on. So, but thank you for watching.
My question is, maybe advice I should say, is how do we get people from rural areas outside of your urban centers to get on the train with the Libertarian Party, and especially in these topics, because they're so consumed by this Trump DeSantis nonsense that they can't see past that.
Look, some people, they're going to have to be burned. I mean, look, here's the reality. If your guy was Trump and he presided over the lockdowns, the most egregious infringement on my personal liberty in my lifetime, and you still think that he's the hero that can fix everything, like, good God. I don't know. I don't know how you reach those people, if I'm being perfectly honest. I always just try and meet people where they're at, and I try and focus on, like, whatever anger they have towards the government, I foment that. I go like, yeah, that was fucked up, huh? Let me tell you about 5 other things that are worse. That's always been my angle, and it seems to have worked. Almost everyone in my personal life has become a libertarian or an anarchist, so I think it's a slow grind, you know? So just keep it with it. What's up?
What do you think is the right way to navigate that culture of censorship in terms of some people will limit what they say on certain platforms so that they don't get shadow banned or kicked off. And then there's platforms like Rumble that are more free speech. So like, what do you think is the right way to do that?
It is super complicated, man. You know, for me, I bit my tongue and played by the rules to stay on Twitter all through the old regime. And I'm very grateful that I don't have to bite my tongue quite as much under the new. I've also diversified my video streaming options to Odyssey and Rumble and Rockfin. So I think it's important that you have many fallback plans, because the truth, I've already been banned from YouTube. By a miracle of God, I got let back on. So I think that it's incumbent that you diversify, but here's how they get you. This is the downfall of diversification. If you are on one platform, that means everyone that's interested in you goes to that singular platform. And because of the way the algorithms are established, the more people watch and the more people like and comment in the first 24 hours of something being launched means that it's like a parabolic uptick in actual impressions that it'll have on the audience that are potential for you. So there's a downfall to diversification too. So unfortunately, I don't think there's much of a choice. You know, people in our ideological camp that are going to tell the truth before it's a permissible fact, you have to diversify just to try and keep your voice. So it's very challenging. I think that beyond that, you know, try and support the entrepreneurs that are creating the new platforms that are attempting to circumvent the censorship apparatus. I'm very fortunate that because of my audience, I get emailed and contacted about people that are working on stuff like that all the time. So I try and give them advice and root them on. So we'll find a way. It's going to be challenging, but honestly, I think things are improving. The fact that Twitter has been acquired by a dude who doesn't appear to be completely under their thumb has put a lot of pressure on the other social media platforms to kind of soften. I mean, even YouTube has been talking about trying to lighten restrictions, because I think they realize that their lunch is getting eaten by Rumble. So we need competition. Unfortunately, we're in a fascistic oligopoly, so it's going to be tough.
Well, you and Dave Smith have said that the primary goal of the Libertarian Party should be to gather votes. Let's really put the message. So what do you think about RFK's bid for presidency and his endorsement out of the question?
Is an endorsement from me out of the question?
You or?
Yeah, no, it's not out of the question. He's interesting because he's got a bunch of incredible positions, and then he'll tweet a Lincoln quote talking about unifying the country. And I'm like, oh shit. He's obviously great on the COVID issue. He has had some very concerning comments about, you know, going after people for denialism when it comes to climate change and carbon, and that to me is a non-starter. He has, you know, soft-sold it or backpedaled slightly, which is good, but like if that was still your instinct a few years ago, that concerns me. I don't know. he's pretty good on Ukraine, but he also is like, my son's fighting there, and it's the most noble thing in the world. And I'm like, I don't know. And then his like daughter-in-law is a CIA agent, and she's running his campaign. It's like but his uncle and his father were murdered by the CIA. I can't get a read on this guy. He's very complicated. So I like him. I think he's absolutely vital that like he get on the debate stage, and I will be rooting him along. Would I endorse him? Probably not. But if Dave doesn't run, then maybe. I don't know. Yeah.
Kind of on the similar topic, what do you think of Vivek Ramaswamy?
I should actually have Vivek on in like 8 or 9 days. I'm a big fan. I think that he's very similar to RFK. Phenomenal when it comes to ESG. Phenomenal when it comes to his analysis of the the administrative state. I think he's like, because of his background, he's got a lot of the skill set that's necessary to really undermine and rip a lot of that shit out. So I like that. I do not like the fact that he wants to quadruple down on the drug war and declare war against the cartels in Mexico, given that it's a narco state, which would mean that it's actually a war against the Mexicans. No, thank you, Vivek. So it's like you just can't get one perfect candidate. It's just so frustrating. Ron, run again. Yeah, and his foreign policy, he seems to be good on Ukraine, but I don't know enough about it to say otherwise. Is he neocon? Please tell me he's not.
I have no idea. I haven't heard it.
Okay, yeah. Well, everything I've heard from him on foreign policy has been good, other than Mexico, which I'm like, what are you doing?
From what I've seen, he seems to be a military isolationist as far as keeping our military.
Right. Awesome.
That's just what I've seen. I've been following him a lot, maybe with curiosity.
Yeah.
He seems to be pretty on point with stuff.
He would be by far the most intelligent person to ever be the president of the United States. Like quantum leaps, full standard deviation above anybody else. So I really hope that he's on the debate stage, and I think that he can actually like really shake things up. So he and RFK are like my favorites that are in it so far. Any more? You guys hungry? All right, let's eat.